Well, good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. I am very excited to be a part of this presentation and webinar with you. One of the things that is so great about this is that this was truly a wonderful collaboration that created a partnership of support for student learning and success. So we had the funds that were through the NITC and channeled through TREC, and then the Oregon Department of Transportation was a key partner in this project, along with the fact that it was through Portland State, and then what was called the Portland Metro STEM Partnership, a collaboration of stakeholders to support STEM education. And two of our schools that were a part of that were the STEM schools, Tobias Elementary in Hillsborough and Chehalem Elementary in Beaverton School District, that were wonderful partners. So this was a grant that was started because we were seeing that a lot of times there was connections with STEM professionals, the community, folks that aligned into the and engaged in the school, but it was that tended to be a one-time experience where they would come in and engineer engineer day, or maybe a one-sided connection where a teacher would invite a parent in to share expertise, or a community member to share expertise, but there wasn't this kind of really collaborative connection. So the idea was, the need to promote STEM and connect and build on the assets and resources of the stakeholders to bring about what we were hoping for, this transformational change. And so we wanted to have this grant be the kind of the premise for harnessing that professional expertise, experience and enthusiasm of the transportation sector, but then also engage with elementary teachers that know kids, know that education needs, and really create this investigation for students to explore. It was an 18-month grant, and from this session, what we want to do, we're really quite proud of the work. I was the grant coordinator, but we had lead teachers and collaborating teachers and our STEM professionals and research staff. But we want to be able to share the impact that it had on teachers, students, and the transportational professionals, but more importantly, share the lessons learned. The protocols and steps that I'm going to share will be are already in an informational document on the NITC grant site that will be shared at that link will be shared at the end of the presentation, and then also has my email at the end for any further questions, so that the idea is that you would be able to replicate this process in some way as you go forward with your work. So the idea for the grant, we knew that we were going to have an investigation in transportation, but the pathway that our grant ended up taking with the two schools was around this idea of the parking lot dilemma. As I worked with lead teachers first, and then we brought in their collaborating grade level partnering teachers, and of course all the students. The direction was really quite organic, of realizing, hey, what is the transportation problem that we want these kiddos to become engineers to help design solutions based on application of real world problems. So both schools realized that their parking lot and their school grounds area was problematic, and that's where it came up to be this parking lot dilemma. So two elementary schools, one focused, it was fifth grade focus, the other was a combination of 5th and 6th grade students to do the investigation. So the first part of this presentation is going to share that planning process that was involved, and which entailed pretty much the first 6 months. We received about a $69,000 grant from NITC, and my role was a grant coordinator to provide that structure for this initial planning process and then the implementation process. But obviously this was in conjunction with our researcher and our Oregon Department of Transportation liaison. So in this initial project planning, the grant coordinator, which was myself, worked with the grant researcher. We did have a person in the Portland Metro STEM partner that was our partnership and development director, and that person was key in kind of helping, connect the people. And one of the key people that was part of the, in the initial grant writing phase was the Oregon Department of Transportation Assistant Project Manager. And then once the grant got going and we got it approved, we did have what we called our 2 lead teachers, one from each of the schools that were directly involved in the planning, the sharing, the implementing, and reflecting on the transportation unit. At each of those 2 schools, they had 2 other teachers at the grade level for a total then of 6 teachers, 3 at each of the schools. We were very, very fortunate. ODOT reached out to their staff within their own agency and a lot of their supporting consultant companies to get volunteer transportation professionals that not only helped with the unit planning but then actually went into the classroom and then worked with the students during unit implementation. And their transportation consulting firms actually released the volunteers to be able to do this planning, which was very beneficial. And we were able to engage about 160 students at those 2 grade levels at the 2 schools. So as we started the whole process, we were bringing together those transportation professionals to help with the planning and our lead teachers, and it was really important to build a relationship, this sense of trust, this shared sense of community as we were going forward in this work, because it was 2 different groups that had not been together in the planning, and in a typical situation this was pretty unique to have this collaborative planning with such intense possibilities. So that idea of creating trust. So one of the first things we did, we had 3 sessions with 3 hours each that we got together for this initial planning, and at the first session did this license plate community building activity, and we wanted to have this transportation kind of connection and twist to it. So we had each of the, there were about 12 of us around the table at that first meeting, and start making those connections of kind of sharing out who they were, and it created this kind of sense of getting to know each other, getting to find out what they each person was bringing to the table, very fun insights into folks. So that was a great connecting activity with that lens of what brings you to the table, and who are you as with it. The other big connection that we brought to the table was this idea that this was a research grant, and so all the stakeholders being involved in that was part of research. And one of the key premises of the Portland Metro STEM Partnership is this theory of change, that if we want to have students being in an effective learning environment around STEM, that they need to be developing their own academic identity and motivation resilience as a STEM learner, being able to apply conceptual knowledge, and really using higher order cognitive thinking skills as a career-ready participant as they leave the K-12 system. So we have to create this learning environment, and so the classroom teacher needs to be able to have the supportive teacher-student relationship, have their own knowledge of, hey, what does it take to teach math, to teach science, and have effective instructional practices. Well, that doesn't necessarily come naturally, and so creating professional development experience. So this grant was going to be able to provide the professional development experience for the teachers to be able to create that effective STEM learning environment. So that was kind of that if-then kind of relationship with that. So our grant had specific research goals. That idea around increasing those effective teacher instructional practices. Often in the past, teachers would design lessons around, okay, we're going to get kiddos to have this, content knowledge around science or math or engineering. Or they would do, okay, now we're going to really be working on some of those cognitive processing skills of being able to analyze, being able to ask questions, being able to reflect on data, being able to present. But then, that often the two weren't intertwined. They were kind of separate experiences. Now we're going to do inquiry. Now we're going to learn the facts. Or that was the other concern where it was kind of, just vocabulary and rote memorization of facts. And so we wanted to shift that to really have, more higher level and deep content knowledge. And then also kind of those diverse learning opportunities, instead of just being more teacher-centered, going to that student-centered and bringing in different opportunities for how kids can engage and learn. And as elementary teachers, one of the things that we realize is that oftentimes, needing some support in the higher level math, the higher level science, elementary teachers were practitioners that were master of all different subjects, engaging kids in all the different content areas. So being able to support elementary teachers, increasing their own math knowledge of like what does it take to be able to teach those curriculum areas and then show that real world connection. From the student level, the grant goal was really to increase that academic identity, seeing themselves as a STEM learner, and that motivational resilience where they are enthusiastically involved in that hard work and persistent, and that really being able to apply the conceptual knowledge that they need within the different disciplines. We focused on the math and then the science with that to really create that effective STEM learning environment. So trying to model what the whole thing we wanted to get across with students at that first meeting of all this, primary stakeholders, we wanted to connect and inspire them in STEM. And so we had them engage in doing the science themselves and doing some engineering. They had two different types of sand, one which was magic sand, which is, repels water, and then regular sand. And they were able to do some investigating, some I notices, some I wonders, start thinking about, what could have been the engineering design applications of what problems. This happens to be something that was originally developed to soak up oil spills and turned out to be a little bit cost prohibitive and turned into then a fun and engaging thing, but then also some great connections for putting sand around different moisture collecting or moisture repelling areas with that. So got to do some very engaging science, had some fun with that, and then to kind of realize that, hey, if we're going to be creating this investigation in transportation, it really does take, not only our Oregon Department of Transportation engineers, but to also then our educators who have this background and knowledge of how kids learn, what they need to do, those kind of planning with that. Bringing together the fact that there are standards that our students need to be working towards and mastering. In math and literacy, it's the Common Core, and in science, it's the next generation science standards. And when you put that all together, we really would end up creating that engaging, effective learning environment that we talked about in that theory of change. So that idea of helping the teachers and the transportation professionals know what is expected in these standards as we are moving students to be college and career ready. So the other thing that the group needed to realize is that if we are trying to then create these STEM units, that the teachers need to have this math background, they need to have the science background in order to then kind of figure out those connecting points. And that as teachers, we needed to know what is it that what are the knowledge and skills that transportation professionals, real world, career folks need in order to start, giving kids a reason to, learn math, a reason to learn science. So it was a really powerful and fun discussion where we just listened, and each of the professionals share their story of what do you do in your profession? What do you what are the things that you had to know in order to accomplish that? So spent some time listening to each of the professionals tell about their work, and then the teachers got to tell it like it is of what are the things that they are experiencing and facing in trying to have all students meet all standards and be engaged in this schooling experience. So kind of realizing what's what are each of our personal connections, what are the dilemmas that we're facing within our roles and responsibilities, and how can we work together to create a learning experience for students. So actually got a chance to provide some time for we focused on one area at a time. So we first started to look at math. So the 5th and 6th grade teacher said, hey, one of the key things that we need to learn in master starting at 5th and 6th grade is about this idea of numbers and operations around fractions. So it was educating for the STEM professionals to realize, oh, that's what is needing to be taught to the students today. And oh gosh, I remember back when I was in school I had to learn that too. Similar skill set, but the application of that knowledge is so important today versus just kind of here's the skills in isolation. So wanting to bring that relevancy and connections that the transportational professionals were starting to say, yep, I use fractions here, yep, I use fractions here, yep, I use measurement here, was some fun connections as we went through that. We did that by dividing into it. This was, again, the very first session right towards the end, and then we delved into it even further in the second session where they got a chance to look at the standards and start brainstorming activities to connected to the real-world relevancy of those Common Core State Standards, again, first around math and then to science with that. So what we ended up also then doing was shared just a little bit about, what does it take to create an effective unit. There was a little bit of accountability here. The principals had signed on to having their teachers and be a part of this project, but it was a little bit of a leap of faith in that if we take the teachers out of the regular instructional curriculum for math or the instructional materials for science or the things that they had done in the past, will that make a difference in student learning and student engagement and student identity? And so that idea that this was a whole unit that was being created, kind of that idea of a 4 to 6 week unit to think about that. And so had this discussion about what does make an effective unit in order to make sure that we have some accountability for making an impact on student learning versus what had been previously done. So one of the instructional models is called the 4E times 2 model. There's one also called a 5E, where the first thing you do is engage kids in the content understanding or the conceptual learning that wants to happen. Give them an opportunity to explore, do enough activities and learning experiences that they'd be able to explain the concept and how to apply it, and then extend it, going actually applying it to the real world, extending it beyond their original kind of premise of learning. And in the 5E model they evaluate at the end, but the 4E times 2 model is that all along you're assessing, are the kids getting it, and giving students an opportunity to reflect on, am I understanding it? What do I still need to get clarification about? What questions do I need to ask? So that was kind of how we designed like the setup of here's what we're going to do to create the unit, and how can we end up looking at that. So a really, again, generative, organic opportunity was when the industry professionals had this knowledge now, okay, we understand these standards of what the students need to be learning, and let's start thinking about what could be some real world connections. So we ended up just kind of having a brainstorming document that where the unit ideas and resources related to transportation themes. So here were the science standards for 5th grade, the math standards, and then start thinking about what could be some connections to those possibilities. So, here's all the different things in science that 5th graders needed to learn by the end of the year, mainly the things, and then for the math areas. And so we started to think about what are some of the connections, and it was the most, again, organic, generative things where these transportation professionals were able to say, there's those markings on the road, thinking about which, are some substances that are able to make sure that those markings stay there and are durable. Thinking about the different road materials, and started making those connections. I never thought that there would be any possible connection to the fact that they needed to fifth graders needed to understand the impact of, the seasonal progression of the sun in the sky, and the transportation professional said, whoa, there's, actually one of the things we investigate is the impact of shadows and the impact of sun glare, and how does that impact as far as the visual cues and road signage. So that idea for connection and solar technology of using for signage, alternative transportation. So brainstormed all these different areas for how there could be this real-life connection to the different things, the migratory patterns on the waste runoff from the different metals that are released, and how that impacts students, and what about if roads are created. So that whole idea of that brainstorming, and that's then when we ended up having it to go to the idea of, there we go, of actually then picking the idea of going with the parking lot dilemma problem. So at that time we had gone through the 3 sessions of 3 hours each, very again engaging sessions for having the folks feel like they were able to create what made sense to the group. And we just got started with the transportation professionals before they then bowed out in order to give the teacher some really heavy-duty planning time in order to create the unit plan of what would the 4 to 6 week unit look like, what would be going on, what would be the things we'd want them to connect with in science, math, language arts, and even some art through it, and where would we end up having the transportation professionals join back in with supporting the data collection process, learning about the different transportation situations. It turned out that the teachers worked with myself and a researcher for about 15 to 20 hours on that unit planning. It's a pretty tedious process to create this new unit from scratch, connecting to maybe some previous things that they've done, but pretty much from scratch with that. And then the fun part begins. This is the part that these lead teachers had created this unit, and now the idea of implementing the unit and getting the kiddos all engaged and participating. One of the things that entailed then was, okay, these lead teachers had been working on this unit. How does it work for getting their colleagues on board? So when the grant was submitted and we had selected the schools, the grade level teams had to say, yep, we are all on board, but now it was like, okay, bringing back what was going to be happening. And originally both schools were going to be doing this in the fall. The initial planning had happened between January and April, and then a little bit in the summer, and the idea was to implement it in the fall, but both schools had some scheduling constraints that caused both schools to end up delivered in January. And one of the great things about the grant, not only did it fund the research staff and my part of my position, but it also then provided compensation for the teachers to have this planning time. Instead of just doing it out of the goodness of their heart, they were compensated with a stipend. And then they had also built in some sub-release time and extended contract time for the teachers to come back and the teachers to do some sense making about learning the unit that they were going to end up being instructing. And so they created some individual lesson plans for being able to say, okay, this is what we're going to be doing, here's the materials, because the teachers, the lead teachers had developed this, but the idea of how can I support my colleagues back at the school to be able to then do the lesson, so kind of taking them through with that. So at Tobias, so Chehalem did kind of this intense 16 days where they did their unit, pretty much almost the whole day, at least half of the day they were incorporating it. At Tobias, our lead teacher, was quite the cheerleader for saying, hey, I can, I'm excited about doing this. I think that this is really going to make an impact on kids learning. Look at the engaging activities that we have. And so they did do it over a 6-week session, and really there was collaborative. There was such enthusiasm from the lead teachers to bring it back that they ended up putting trust. And that was the other thing that we support in the professional development. How can you as a lead teacher help bring your colleagues on board with that? Again, another real benefit of the grant was that it funded the student materials. The teachers were able to pick out resources that connected directly with the unit to be able to get that idea, those instructional materials that would really engage them in the students feeling like they're using real-world tools. Our transportation professionals were real helpful in that, and then the lead teachers got some time to look at what are some literacy resources to help engage the kids. So that idea of the STEM literacy connection ended up funding these sets of materials that were going to be used this year, last year, the first year, and then for further years to come as they investigated transportation with future groups of students. Then came the transportation professionals taking on a different role from the planning part to actually then going into the classroom. All 7 of our original transportation professionals had said at the end, that they would love to be able to connect into the classroom besides just being the planning process. They were thinking, hey, I want to go to that next step of being in. But when it got moved to January, it only conflicted with a number of their schedules, and so we had 2 professionals that started with Chehalem, and both of them said, hey, I really want to connect and continue on with Tobias as they were working on theirs. And so Gail and Kelly were from 2 of our consulting firms here in Portland, and their time within the unit implementation, about 7 different times that they went in and worked with the kiddos, was the highlight of the unit, where they got a chance to be a role model, got to share their expertise, and really, again, brought that sense of authenticity to the student work. So as they spent time with the professional, not only did they gather information, but they got to ask questions kind of connected to then this idea of actually going forward and solving this parking lot dilemma. So as they went in through the different lessons, the students began to learned how to measure, record, and report their findings as far as how many kids ride the bus, what is the area of the different parking spaces, what is the areas that as they back out, is there enough room if you have a lineup of cars of parents picking up kids. What about when the kindergartners are coming, and they actually got a chance to videotape and do all kinds of different recording of their findings. And actually going out, doing the measurement, to be able to help think about what could be a solution that we as engineers could design to solve our parking lot dilemma. So the teams worked on it. The STEM professionals came in and helped the teams with as far as what to consider, the kind of mapping out the before and after of what the parking lot looks like now, what could it look like. It was a really great generative learning situation that was the second part of the unit for really then designing the solution after they had all these different data with that. Then the culminating aspect for the students was that they got a chance to present. There were, at both schools, there were some pretty powerful stakeholders. There was from the district, folks from safety, folks from maintenance, folks from the public, policy makers, folks from the engineering, all coming and hearing the presentation to find out, what is this dilemma? Obviously the principals were there, and the students had to determine how they were going to present it. They had different group presentations in the classrooms, and then the final 3 projects were presented at both of the different schools. So they had a chance to, create, a compelling argument for theirs. Each of the 3 main groups that were the, say, finalists got a chance to present at both of the schools to determine, okay, we are very serious about this work, and we feel that we can make a difference in, solving this problem. So one of the great things that, both during and after the unit, the teachers had been kind of monitoring. One of the communication folks from Trek here came and interviewed the teachers and students to see, what's the impact that was going on, and the student engagement was something that the teachers really felt was just, definite increase in how they felt and were engaged in going home and sharing with their parents about the different things that were going on. And then the teachers, got a chance to reflect on it, that that these kids, they felt that the kids were invested, the parents realizing that, boy, our kids are coming home and talking about what's going on in school, and that they are, very, again, serious that they can be the ones to make the difference. I got a chance to, get some input from the STEM professionals. This was, again, something they were volunteering their time with, of taking some time out of their day to come to the schools and work there. And they just really felt that they were a part of the experience. They loved seeing the kids learning. They felt that they were contributing to students' learning. That was not something that they realized had been a possibility in the past. This model ended up being one that went forward for several other grants and program designs, of having this collaborative model with STEM professionals. And they did not take these results very these lightly. It turned out where at Chehalem, the principal took the kiddos' ideas and had them present them a second time of revising and saying, okay, here's what the safety folks said, here's what the facilities folks said, and revise and change your models with that. And that they were going to determine, all right, so what can we do to really make a difference, and come up with 3 choices, and taking that further to the actual school district to make some changes. After the unit had been developed, we had built in some opportunities for actually to reflect on the data to see, hey, did this process make a difference? And so there had been a performance task that the students took in afterwards. So here they had been going through all these experiences, and this was modeled after some of the performance tasks that they're expected to be able to do on some of the different assessments that are given at both the classroom level, but then also at the state level, to see, can students apply their knowledge of fractions. So this was the idea that they had to then create a parking lot based on what could the pathway be of the area using the different fractional portions. One of the things though that was they had it as a post only. It would not have been kind of fair to the kiddos to have at the beginning of the unit to try and be able to do this particular problem. So it was just kind of a post only. So the teachers were able to compare to previous years, how did it seem that students were acquiring this knowledge of fractions. And what the teachers realized, and kind of the impact that we had from the project, is that the authentic learning experiences were critical to the unit's success, being that high level engagement that we talked about, and that this idea of students realizing that we can learn from each other, and that when the teachers create those opportunities, that there's definitely an increase in both not only student identity but that conceptual understanding. And this idea of having it place-based, very relevant, at the school level itself, resulted in that ownership and that relevancy for both the teachers and the students. Kind of some of the lessons learned, the fact that going forward, all teachers being involved in that refinement and the delivery model, rather than just having, it now being the lead teachers unit coming back, but now seeing it as a high level. They realized some foundational skills that they needed to develop before jumping into this unit. They wanted to, make sure that engineering, design, and math would be, strongly emphasized. And also then, making sure that, hey, how are we doing as far as aligning to the targets? One of the things, they were so involved in the implementation of this unit that they did not do those formative assessment checkpoints that would have helped kind of, with that monitoring, adjusting from the grant standpoint. At the project level, we really felt that we had a cohesive plan for, engaging everyone in the implementation. We did have some challenges. There were several different changes in grant staffing. Our researcher changed, our partnership person changed, and then the school scheduling was some complex. So it definitely, as far as lesson learned going forward, is maintaining a timeline and kind of that closer researching monitoring. That partnership thing was really strong connections, that wonderful volunteering of ours. It turned out that we had only female engineers, which was great in some respects, but also, it was just one aspect for that, and we had a limited number of volunteers for the school site because of the timing. So a little bit more time for the recruiting the volunteers and future projects would be kind of a lesson learned. So that brings us to questions.
Great, thank you, Carol. We have a couple questions here. If you have any questions, other questions, feel free to keep submitting those in the questions pane of your webinar panel there. While I'm getting to those, it looks like we should have time to get these answered, but feel free to keep submitting them. The first question we have here is, do you know of other partnership programs like this that pair transportation agencies and educators?
So when we were doing some little bit of research of what have others done, in creating this, in Wisconsin they had created a transportation unit, but again it was a little bit of where there were transportation folks that developed the unit and then pass the unit on to educators, and great rich activities, engaging activities, but that collaborative model seemed to be fairly unique in creating the unit together and having it from the site-based dilemma. So there were some really fun, there's great units out there that involve the idea of transportation theme that were great starting points. None of them were quite as long as we were looking at, and none had incorporated the next generation science standards yet because they were so new. But then this was a great piggyback off of this learning for then some other grants that we had that we ended up connecting with the folks at the zoo, folks at Outdoor Ed program, and then some community-based professionals that were engineers, not necessarily transportation engineers, but then engineers for like how could we have these units with water study be a part, so that kind of learning with that.
And this is perhaps related, but someone was curious, are there funding opportunities that you know of for other efforts if someone wanted to put together something like this?
Right. So again, this was from NITC, the request for proposal. one of the premises is that having, it be, school-based connections is, whether it's biking, whether it's, as far as learning about transportation safety, that connection role is something that the NITC grants have funded. When we started to look at, there's different, because STEM is something that is coming to the forefront nationwide and at each of the different state levels, there are, we were connected with what is called the Portland Metro STEM Partnership, which was a STEM hub here in Oregon. There are 6 STEM hubs, and they have funding through our state, our Oregon Department of Education, for doing programming, some professional development, some with programming. So in many of the states, there are entities that are promoting STEM education, and they are purposefully looking for these partnership opportunities. So within each of the states, to be looking at what are the STEM partnerships that are, and what are the entities that support those. So whether it's a STEM hub, whether it's a, your state level Department of Education that has a STEM focus. In the Every Student Succeeds Act that has just recently been handed out, that idea of, STEM education is in the forefront, and so looking at where, what are the funds, and that was what was this idea of it's a partnership in writing the grant and then implementing the grant, that there are those resources out there, and those would be the suggestions of looking at what are the, in each of the states there is a focus on STEM, and again in some different levels there's these STEM organizations, and often at the state level united kind of collaboration for the idea of promoting STEM education, and then the release and call for requests for proposals for that, where it calls for having stakeholders, such as the transportation professionals, with then the education community. And that would then be that premise of like, okay, do I just call on any school to see if they want to partner, and that there's STEM schools in so many different areas that are looking for those partnerships. And like I said, that funding really helped supporting that release of the teacher time, the planning and coordination, and then also the materials in order to make this successful.
Here's one is, did any of the students' recommendations get implemented, and if not, how did the kids feel about it?
So these, at both of the schools, they were the top of their class. They're like or top of the school, where the 5th grade, and then they head on to the middle school, and then or 6th grade, and they head on to the middle school. Both schools, they did do some painting, like where they looked at the painting and changing the spaces. At Chehalem, they were able to identify that they had one additional handicap parking space in the front area that they did not need because they had one in the back area, and so they were working with facilities for having that parking space changed. And at both of the schools, they implemented procedural changes as far as where they had parent drop-off to avoid that. So they felt pretty good. Both schools, the ultimate one was redesign, where like they had planned on some grass area to be, dug up and stuff, and that did not get implemented. But they certainly felt like their voice was heard, and that that there was going to be first step changes, but next step changes have not happened, which then puts great ideas onto then the lead teachers are both saying, hey, if we solve this problem, this year, what do we do next? And the fact that there's continuous things on campus that can promote for transportation dilemmas, the fact that they did not get into the heavy metal flow. There was a water area at both areas that they said next year, which is now this year, that they were both going to look at then that environmental impact and making a difference on that for watching how that water flow does. Make a difference of where that water goes and how it impacts vegetation and wildlife.
So how would you recreate this project in future years, and would you use the same context of a parking lot or new dilemmas each year?
Right. So I think that because of that authenticity, the teachers felt that they would come back around to parking lot only after, say, several years, because all of their work was posted for every student in the school to see. Some of their plans were posted on bulletin boards. Many of the classes shared with their buddy classes or with the grade level, the next grade, say like the fourth graders, or in order to hear about this, because they saw the kids out there doing that. So, and that was what was so great about the fact that they have those other possible transportation dilemmas. Lighting came up as a factor of lighting the parking lot, lighting the pathway, and they also talked about the flow of traffic. So there were plenty of different situations. So the teachers really felt that in order to make it authentic and credible, that they didn't, because even though they were guiding the students to head to the parking lot dilemma, in their instruction, they did have the kids go and survey the kind of the campus area to identify different transportation problems and dilemmas. And they said, gosh, one of the key things for this group, they guided them to the parking lot. We use this model for, like I said, some additional grants that came through the partnership, as far as having stakeholders do the planning right with the teachers for the unit creation, and then having them involved in the implementation, so that that career connection and that real-life relevancy ended up being a model for 3 different grants, like we talked about, at the zoo, with the water services, and then also with some of the entities for some of our businesses. We have Intel out here for some of our volunteers that were involved with engineering, some of the electrical and circuitry type of work for real-life dilemmas. So that this model of having them involved in the planning, and then being able to have then the connection with some STEM professionals within the implementation, so that kids see them as a role model, but then also the learning embedded within it, versus one time I'm going to share about my career.
And the last question we have here is, how early a grade do you think this would work for?
It's interesting. This one, we picked the 5th grade team at each of the schools because they were the oldest, and thought, hey, if try with this grade level. But then with other grants, we did go down to 3rd grade with kind of that unit planning and implementing at each of the grade levels. I would say that 3rd graders could have easily been involved in this, because some of the skills of measuring, some of that idea of science about matter, the painting of the line materials on the road. 3rd grade also has that connection to matter and properties of matter, temperature with that, states of matter. So it's pretty amazing what kids will rise to the occasion with when they see a relevancy and connection to, trying to come up with a solution for that. The fact about, kids learning about bike safety and bike transportation is, K-12, with trying to make that connection. But again, what's the problem that is involved? What's the science and math and literacy learning that needs to happen in order to solve that problem is what was a powerful thing about this particular grant. And I think that it could happen at any grade level, but like I said, having the teachers having this knowledge, having someone that is that was my area of expertise of knowing curriculum instruction and the standards and being able to provide the professional learning experiences for both the transportation professionals and the teachers, was definitely needed. And having our researcher involved in saying, hey, is what you're planning going to have an impact and how can we measure it? So I think that it could be designed for being able to make that real-life relevancy and connection for any of the grade levels. But third, fourth, and fifth, the content is meaty enough, juicy enough to, and again, many of these kiddos, and we start saying, they were starting to see themselves as true engineers. That connection was something that was kind of really fun for them to see. Okay, yep, when I, head on to middle school, I'm going to have my continued focus and even onto high school and college.
Mm-hmm. They do look pretty proud in the picture there.
They definitely did, yeah. Yeah, they were very proud.
Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up the webinar. I want to thank you for joining us today, and thanks again to Carol for sharing your work. You can view other professional development offerings on our website, which is nitc.us. This concludes our webinar. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.